Thank you for your question. I think it's a very fair question. I also think it echoes a lot of the tension that is surrounding a lot of US foreign policy at the moment, not just with Saudi Arabia, but internationally. Jamal Khashoggi's murder was undeniably a horrific crime, and it undeniably violated the most basic principles of human rights, as well as freedom of expression and basic rule of law. And this administration wholeheartedly recognizes these as core American values, and President Biden has never wavered in that, which is why early in this administration we declassified and released the U.S. intelligence community's assessment and concluded that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman did approve Khashoggi's murder. And I believe that transparency makes a clear difference from past administrations. But at the same time, US policymakers have to confront a reality that political scholars have long recognized, which is that there's often an irreducible and obvious tension between ethical values and national interests. And in this case, critical US interests were at stake. I mean, you have to consider regional stability in the Middle East, counterterrorism cooperation, global energy security, efforts to deter Iran, competition with China and Russia. And so ignoring those interests would not advance human rights. It would actually risk worsening instability and suffering across the Middle East and put America in a less than ideal position, to say the very least. President Biden has tried to manage this tension differently than his predecessor. The Trump administration openly embraced what it called principled realism, which prioritized transactional interests like arms sales and investments, but honestly, they largely sidelined human rights concerns at the leadership level. So while the Trump administration did sanction some Saudi individuals, it avoided confronting senior leadership and downplayed intelligence findings. President Biden has taken a very different approach. He's placed human rights at the center of US foreign policy rhetoric and early action. The intelligence report was released, visa restrictions and sanctions were imposed, and a number of arms transfers were paused to reassess their use. These steps, I believe, reflect a lot of values that are not just moral preferences, but strategic assets that shape US credibility and leadership across the globe. Look at history. It shows that disengagement and moral absolutism rarely produce justice or reform and often reduce our ability to influence outcomes. Just because we engage does not mean that we're endorsing. So, the president's meeting with Saudi leaders, and particularly his widely discussed handshake, was not about absolutism. It was about advancing concrete U.S. interests while continuing to raise human rights concerns directly. In fact, this administration has raised cases of political prisoners and civil society repression with Saudi officials much more consistently and more publicly than before. So, how would we characterize this approach? I don't think it's purely realist. I don't think it's purely liberal either. I think it's best understood as a form of realism that's heavily informed by American values. And this is a strategy that acknowledges power, that acknowledges interests, it acknowledges constraints, but it insists that the norms and the accountability and international standards that we follow do matter. And liberal internationalism informs us of our institutions, alliances, and human rights reporting. Constructivist logic shapes our insistence on norms and signaling, but realism reminds us that disengagement can sometimes reduce, not increase, our leverage with foreign governments. So, to the Canadians who worry that this looks like a sellout, I would say this: walking away may feel morally satisfying, but it rarely produces justice or reform. Our goal here is not moral purity, it is measurable improvement over a long period of time, and we want fewer abuses and greater accountability as well. This administration believes that defending human rights is hardest when it matters most, which is typically in relationships that are strategically necessary but at the same time morally complicated. So we'll continue to press Saudi Arabia on human rights, we'll continue to document abuses honestly, and we'll continue to impose consequences when they're appropriate, but we're going to continue to protect US national interests and global stability. And the balance is not easy, but it is responsible leadership. Thank you.